It is the autumn of 1943, and somewhere in the rolling Silesian countryside of occupied Poland, a man is walking. He is dressed in civilian clothes, a rough-cut jacket, trousers pressed flat from weeks of hiding beneath a mattress, papers folded into an inside breast pocket still warm from the body heat of the man who printed them 3 hours ago. He is a Royal Air Force flight lieutenant. He has not been a free man for 14 months. And yet, here he is, moving through the gray morning mist with his hands in his pockets, heading towards a railway station that will take him either home or to a firing squad. No one who watches him cross the road gives him a second glance. What made this possible was not courage alone, though courage was required in quantities most of us will never comprehend. What made it possible was a small, unremarkable object that had been passed to him through the wire of Stalag Luft 3, a folded paper map so finely produced that its lines showed roads, rivers, elevation markings, and village names across a region he had never set foot in. It weighed almost nothing. It could be folded down to the size of a playing card. It could survive being swallowed, if necessary. It would not dissolve in rain. Under a German guard's torch, it looked, to all intents and purposes, like nothing at all. That map came from a place called the Inter-Services Research Bureau, though almost nobody called it that. Most people who worked there didn't fully understand what the organization beside them was doing. The public had no idea it existed, and the Germans, despite their considerable intelligence apparatus, never did penetrate the heart of what was being produced in its workshops, offices, and converted country houses scattered across wartime Britain. The organization's real name was MAO 9. Its purpose was escape. Its methods were, by any measure, extraordinary. And in the course of 6 years of war, the gadgets, devices, maps, compasses, and hidden tools it produced helped more than 1.3 million Allied servicemen evade capture, survive imprisonment, or return to Allied lines from behind enemy territory. To understand why this mattered, why a map printed on silk could shift the balance of an air campaign, you have to understand the problem that created ME9 in the first place. By the autumn of 1939, the British military had a problem that nobody had properly planned for, because planning for it felt dangerously close to planning to lose. Soldiers get captured, airmen get shot down, sailors get sunk. In any sustained conflict, a percentage of your fighting force will end up behind enemy lines, and what happens to them next has an enormous bearing on the war's outcome, not just in terms of the manpower that can return to the front, but in terms of the intelligence those men carry and the resources the enemy must devote to keeping them imprisoned. The Great War had seen roughly 170,000 British prisoners taken by the Central Powers. Some escaped, most did not. The tools available to them were rudimentary at best. Crude compasses improvised from gramophone needles, maps torn from pre-war travel guides, civilian clothes cobbled together from scraps. The escape rate was dismal. The infrastructure to support escapers barely existed. When a man went over the wire in 1917, he was largely on his own. But the Second World War was shaping up to be a conflict of a fundamentally different kind. The RAF's strategic bombing campaign meant that from 1940 onwards, thousands of young men were flying deep into occupied Europe every single night, over territory that stretched from the French coast to the outskirts of Berlin. The statistical reality was brutal. The average bomber crew had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of being shot down before completing a tour of 30 operations. Many of those men would survive the crash. Many of those survivors would be captured, and a captured RAF navigator carried in his head an extraordinary amount of sensitive information about routes, targets, and tactics that the Luftwaffe's interrogators in Frankfurt am Main were becoming increasingly skilled at extracting. The answer, the War Office slowly decided, was to treat escape and evasion not as a lucky improvisation, but as a military discipline, one that could be taught, resourced, and systematically supported. The man tasked with building this discipline from scratch was a First World War veteran and intelligence officer named Norman Crockett, And in January 1940, working from a single room in the Metropole Hotel in London, he began the work that would eventually save over 1 million lives. Crockett's fundamental insight was elegant in its simplicity. A man who escapes from a German prisoner of war camp or evades capture behind enemy lines needs 3 things above all others. He needs to know where he is. He needs to know where he is going. And he needs to look as though he belongs there. Maps, compasses, and disguise materials. The challenge was getting them to people who were either already imprisoned or about to fly into enemy territory, without the Germans ever realizing what they were doing. The solution that Mi-9 developed over the course of 1940 and 1941 was breathtaking in its ingenuity, and it centered on one material above all others: silk. The printing of maps on fabric was not, in itself, a new idea. Military cartographers had experimented with cloth maps for decades, principally because paper disintegrates in rain and moisture, and a map that turns to pulp the moment a soldier wades through a stream is worse than useless. But the maps that Mi-9 began producing from late 1940 onwards were something categorically different. They were printed on pure silk, or occasionally on rayon when silk supplies ran short, using a process refined at a facility in London and later at workshops across the country. The fabric was treated to accept ink without bleeding, then printed using a modified screen printing technique that could achieve resolutions fine enough to show individual villages, forest boundaries, and minor roads across enormous areas of occupied Europe. The result was a map that folded to the size of a cigarette packet, weighed a few grams, made absolutely no noise when handled, could be screwed up and stuffed into a boot without damage, could be soaked in water and dried flat without distortion, and could, if necessary, be sewn into the lining of a jacket or hidden inside the heel of a shoe. The maps were produced in dozens of regional editions covering France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, and the Mediterranean theater. Some editions were printed on both sides. Some included coded escape routes or the locations of safe houses, indicated by symbols that would be meaningless to a German guard, but legible to a trained Allied serviceman. The question of how to get these maps to the men who needed them produced a second wave of ingenuity that was, if anything, even more remarkable. Before aircrew flew their operational sorties, Mi-9 ensured that escape and evasion kits were sewn directly into their uniforms. Silk maps were folded into the collars of flying jackets. Miniature compasses, no larger than a shirt button, and in many cases disguised as actual shirt buttons, were sewn onto battle dress blouses at positions that any trained eye would know to check. A small compass that could be balanced on a pin or floated on a puddle was produced in quantities that eventually ran into the millions, housed in casings that ranged from genuine-looking trouser buttons to the barrels of fountain pens. For men already imprisoned, the problem was different. Mi-9 needed a method of smuggling escape materials into camps that was systematic enough to work at scale, reliable enough to withstand the scrutiny of German censors, and deniable enough that its exposure would not constitute a war crime under the Geneva Convention. The answer they arrived at was the parcel system, and it was here that Mi-9 demonstrated a level of creative deception that bordered on the theatrical. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It lets us keep telling stories like this one. Working through a network of fictitious charitable organizations, the Licensed Victualers Sports Association, the Prisoners' Wives and Families Society, the Welsh Provident Society, Mi-9 dispatched thousands of parcels to British and Commonwealth prisoners across Germany, Italy, and Poland. These parcels, sent ostensibly by concerned civilians, passed through the Red Cross and through official channels, and were therefore subject to examination by German censors. The censors were thorough. They opened boxes, shook tins, probed food packages with skewers, unrolled bandages, and held letters up to the light. They almost never found what was hidden inside. The preparation of these parcels was carried out by a small team of specialists who had, in effect, invented the science of concealment from first principles. A standard Monopoly board game, genuine, commercially produced, sourced from the manufacturer John Waddington Limited in Leeds, contained in certain specially produced editions sent to camps a silk map concealed beneath the board's printed surface. The "Get Out of Jail Free" card was, in at least one documented case, printed on the reverse of a genuine escape route map. Playing cards, when soaked and separated at the right moment in their manufacturing process, revealed documents pressed between their two laminated halves. A chess set arrived with a hollow bishop that contained a miniature compass. A cribbage board concealed maps rolled to the diameter of a pencil. Waddington's was not the only commercial partner. The manufacturer of a popular brand of boot polish was approached, and a double-bottomed tin was produced that passed visual inspection whilst concealing a folded map and a small quantity of German Reichsmarks, counterfeited to a standard that routinely deceived German bank cashiers. The Reichsmarks were produced by a separate operation entirely, but their utility was obvious. A man walking through Silesia with no money is suspicious. A man with 30 marks in his pocket is merely a traveler. The musical instrument manufacturer Boosie and Hawkes produced a run of harmonicas, perfect in every external detail, in which the internal reed plates had been replaced with hollow cavities containing maps, compasses, and in some cases tiny saws capable of cutting through the wooden bars of a prison window. Gramophone records sent to camp entertainment committees occasionally arrived with a second, thinner disc pressed inside the outer casing, on which was printed not music but cartography. The scale of production was considerable. By the war's end, MY9 and its American counterpart, MIS-X, had produced an estimated 1.7 million escape and evasion aids of various kinds. Exact production figures remain partially classified, and the full extent of the commercial partnerships involved was not publicly acknowledged until decades after the war. The practical impact of these materials in the field is documented in thousands of individual escape reports that passed through MY9's debriefing rooms at the Royal Victoria Patriotic Building in Wandsworth, South London, where every returned evader and escapee was interviewed in exhaustive detail. The testimonies that emerge from these reports form one of the most extraordinary archives of human ingenuity under pressure in the entire historical record. A navigator from a Halifax bomber shot down over the Netherlands in March 1943 walked 63 kilometers over 3 nights using a silk map that had been sewn into the waistband of his uniform trousers. He crossed into Belgium, made contact with a resistance network whose location he had been given in a pre-operational briefing, and was returned to Britain via the Comet Line, the clandestine escape route running from Brussels through occupied France to neutral Spain, within 6 weeks of his aircraft going down. At Stalag Luft 3 in Sagan, where the famous Great Escape was organized in March 1944, escapers carried MY9-produced documents, maps, and compasses amongst their equipment. The escape itself, which saw 76 men leave the camp through a tunnel, was tragically compromised almost immediately, with 50 of the recaptured men subsequently murdered on Hitler's direct orders. But the planning infrastructure that made the tunnel possible, and the materials that equipped the escapers who did briefly reach freedom, owed an enormous debt to what had been smuggled in through the parcel system over the preceding months. In Italy, following the armistice of September 1943, thousands of Allied prisoners walked out of their camps as the Italian guards essentially abandoned their posts. Many of these men survived the subsequent months of wandering in the Apennine Mountains, evading German search parties, sheltered by Italian farming families at extraordinary personal risk, because they carried silk maps that allowed them to navigate towards Allied lines advancing from the south. Estimates suggest that several thousand men returned to Allied control via this route who would otherwise have been recaptured or killed. It is worth pausing to consider what the Germans made of all this, because they were not by any measure unintelligent opponents. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, was perfectly aware that the parcel system was being used to smuggle contraband into camps. They intercepted parcels, tightened censorship protocols, and subjected incoming packages to increasingly rigorous examination. Individual concealment methods once discovered were compromised and abandoned. But MI9's genius lay precisely in the variety and adaptability of its methods. No single channel was indispensable. When gramophone records were banned from certain camps following a discovery, maps continued to arrive in games, in tinned food, in the spines of books. When boot polish tins were banned, the materials moved into differently shaped containers. The organization operated on the principle that the enemy could never know what they were looking for because they had never fully cataloged what existed, and because new methods were being invented faster than old ones could be detected. The American equivalent, MIS-X, which was established in 1942 and operated in close coordination with MI9, developed a parallel set of concealment techniques with an emphasis on different commercial channels suited to American production capabilities. The two organizations shared intelligence extensively, and the combined Anglo-American escape and evasion infrastructure was, by 1944, operating at a scale that had no precedent in the history of warfare. The German Luftwaffe's equivalent organization, the Abteilung Kriegsgefangene, attempted to develop its own escape aids and resistance to interrogation protocols for German airmen shot down over Britain. Their efforts, whilst competent, never matched the systematic sophistication of what MI9 had built, partly because the political culture of the Third Reich made the frank acknowledgement of the possibility of defeat, implicit in planning for mass capture, deeply uncomfortable at the level of high command. The legacy of MI9's work extends well beyond the raw numbers, impressive as those numbers are. The organization had demonstrated, for the first time, that escape and evasion could be industrialized, that the systematic application of design ingenuity and manufacturing capability to the problem of concealment could produce results on a strategic scale. This insight reshaped how subsequent generations of military planners thought about the support infrastructure owed to fighting men and women who end up behind enemy lines. The escape aids produced by MI9 also represent a remarkable episode in the history of design. The miniature compass buttons, the silk maps, the hollow chess pieces, and doctored board games. These objects are simultaneously functional tools and extraordinary examples of applied problem-solving under extreme constraint. The designers who created them, working in conditions of total secrecy with limited materials and constant pressure, produced objects of elegant simplicity that fulfilled their purpose perfectly. A number of surviving examples can be seen today at the Imperial War Museum in London, at the Intelligence Corps Museum at Chicksands in Bedfordshire, and at the International Bomber Command Center in Lincoln. The silk maps, in particular, have attracted considerable scholarly and curatorial attention in recent decades. Several regional editions have survived in private collections, and the Bodleian Library at Oxford holds a significant archive of MI9 documentation declassified in the 1990s that includes original production records, commercial correspondence, and the escape reports from which the individual accounts in this film are drawn. The full extent of the Waddington collaboration, the scope of the counterfeiting operation, and the precise details of the safe-house network that supported returning evaders across occupied Europe remain matters of active historical research. Return for a moment to that Silesian road in the autumn of 1943. The flight lieutenant with the folded map in his pocket, the gray morning mist, the unremarkable walk to a railway station. He is not extraordinary in the sense that tens of thousands of men made similar journeys. He is a trained professional doing what trained professionals do, applying knowledge, keeping calm, using the tools available to him. But the tools available to him were the product of something genuinely remarkable. A secret organization that had decided, in the darkest months of a terrible war, that the men Britain sent into danger above enemy territory deserved more than luck. They deserved a button compass sewn into their battle dress. They deserved a map that weighed nothing and showed everything. They deserved a network of forgers, printers, sleight-of-hand experts, and commercial manufacturers who had quietly agreed to do something extraordinary, to hide the means of freedom inside the ordinary objects of peacetime life: the gramophone record, the board game, the bar of chocolate, the boot polish tin, the harmonica, the chess set, the playing card, the packet of cigarettes. Ordinary things transformed by ingenuity and purpose into instruments of survival. The Germans searched parcels for weapons and contraband. They were right to be suspicious. They were right about almost everything except the thing that mattered most. They were looking for the wrong things in the wrong places, because the people building those parcels understood something fundamental about the nature of concealment. The best hiding place is somewhere that looks exactly as it should. 1.5 million Allied servicemen came home. Hundreds of thousands of them walked, rode, hid, and ran their way back to Allied lines using tools that MI9 had placed in their hands before they ever climbed into an aircraft or set foot on a beach. The organization spent approximately £1 10 shillings per man assisted, by any calculation in the history of military investment, among the most effective money ever spent. Norman Crockett had started with 1 room and no budget. He ended with a secret empire of compassion and craft that the enemy never fully understood and never entirely defeated. The Germans searched every parcel. They found almost nothing. The maps kept arriving. The compasses kept coming. And the men kept walking home.